Well, now we're going to talk about price discrimination. Price discrimination occurs when a firm sells a product to different customers at different prices. Now, there are some conditions on what constitutes legitimate price discrimination. You do have to be selling the product at two different prices, but those prices cannot be based on something cost related. So you can sell people different quantities based on, or sell goods at different prices if they're buying different quantities. So if you buy, a six-pack versus a case, you can sell the product at different prices. But there are certain conditions that have to be met for legitimate price discrimination to occur. That being said, most people look at price discrimination as something bad. I think because the name discrimination or the word discrimination is used in the description. But there are some valuable things that can be achieved if firms are allowed to price discriminate. So let's take a look at what price discrimination is. There are actually different kinds of price discrimination. And let's see if we can identify where the value in price discrimination exists and what we might want to do to perhaps encourage some price discrimination. Price discrimination is technically illegal based on antitrust laws. That being said, it's one of those laws that very few people actively pursue. It's one of those parts of the antitrust laws that just aren't advocated for or pursued very intensely. It's a reality that uniform prices, as far as consumer purchases are concerned, are a relatively recent phenomenon. For most of human existence, there hasn't been this idea that you'll walk into a store, look at the price on the shelf and say, well, that's the price that everybody's going to pay. As you learned in Reinventing the Bazaar, prices are flexible things. There are things that people negotiate. And in most cases, still in a lot of parts of the world, people negotiate over price for a lot of different things, whether those parts of the world are developed parts of the world or not developed parts of the world. So in order to have price discrimination, we first of all have to have the condition that people expect a particular price for the goods that they buy, and that's not always the case. Price discrimination can actually be efficiency enhancing because it can lead to more goods being bought and sold than if everybody pays a uniform price. So that's one of the things that we need to pay attention to as we look at price discrimination. Is it something that actually increases efficiency? Does it mean that there are more things bought and sold? Because if it does mean that, then maybe price discrimination isn't as bad as it sounds. Whenever you are trying, price discrimination requires two primary conditions. One is that you have to be able to distinguish between the groups of buyers. So really what we're talking about here is the ability to find who your buyers are and what their characteristics look like. Specifically, buyers have to have different elasticities of demand. You can't always price discriminate if people have in order to price discriminate, you have to be able to find who has the elastic demand and which portion of your market has the inelastic demand. One great example of this is when you're thinking about an early bird special. The reason early bird specials have lower prices is because the consumers have a much more elastic demand. So for them, demand looks more like this. It's a much flatter demand curve. For your for your patrons who can only come to eat after a particular time, their demand is much more inelastic. So if you can identify how elastic the demand is for your product, you have the ability to distinguish between how elastic or inelastic demands are, and we see this in a case of early bird specials. We see this in the case of matinee prices for movies. We see this in the case of airline tickets sometimes, where people are looking way ahead of time in order to buy a ticket. We see this with tuition, in fact, when people say that when students are willing to admit that they want to be considered for early admission, there's a little bit of a trick there, because that's reflecting an inelastic demand for a particular university. So we see these things in terms of how elastic demand is, or we can even think about tolls on roads. If you live in certain cities, there are tolls on roads that fluctuate. So during rush hour, the tolls are much higher, and during non-rush hour times, the tolls are much lower. We see this with public transportation as well. That's essentially price discrimination, finding where someone is willing to pay a price because they have to be in at a certain time. That means their demand is inelastic. And if people are willing to wait till after rush hour is over, these might be your tourists, then demand is much more elastic. And you can charge those people different prices for those products. So that's one consideration, is you have to be able to distinguish between groups of buyers. The other consideration is that you have to be able to prevent resale. In other words, you have to be able to prevent people from taking advantage of arbitrage opportunities. Arbitrage occurs when you can buy a product and then resell it and make a profit. In fact, one of the stories that I asked you to take a look at involved these guys from Tennessee who bought up a whole bunch of hand sanitizer, and they were going to buy it. They bought it up in Tennessee and Kentucky, I believe, and they were going to try to resell it to other parts of the country. In order to prevent price discrimination, you have to keep people from people like that from reselling that hand sanitizer. Otherwise, they can sell it at much higher prices to people who really, really want it, whose demand is much more inelastic. Now, in the real world, well, not the real world, but in normal circumstances, airlines are really good at preventing resale because you have to show photo ID. They say it's in the interests of security, but that might not be the case. That might not be the real reason. What they might be doing is trying to prevent you from reselling. So buying a ticket at a low price and then reselling it to someone at a higher price and you pocketing some of the money. Restaurants do this with early bird specials. They do this in terms of time constraint. You can't resell a meal. So if you buy it in the early bird time slot, you can't then take it and transfer that meal purchase to somebody later. It's just not in the nature of the good. So those are the two conditions you have to be able to successfully price discriminate. Now, that being said, there are different kinds of price discrimination. One is what we call first-degree price discrimination, or perfect price discrimination. In this case, what you are able to do as a price discriminator is to sell products to every person at a unique price. Basically, everyone pays their true price, the true thing, the true, what we call reservation price for the product. It's kind of like it's kind of like Wonder Woman. So Wonder Woman has this magic lasso, and you put the magic lasso around somebody, and what happens is they have to tell the truth. And what first degree price discrimination is like taking that magic lasso and forcing somebody to tell the truth in terms of what they're really willing and able to pay. So you wrap this person in the magic lasso and they tell you exactly what price they would pay, what their exact specific reservation price would be. This is really actually quite difficult to achieve in practice because you can't wrap somebody up in a magic lasso and force them to tell the truth. Let's say that we have two airlines both flying from a small airport, and they're both monopolists. So they have two different airports, two different airlines, and they're flying from these particular locations. And so you have the same demand curve for both, and the same marginal cost, basically the same cost in terms of fuel and pilots and all this other stuff, and the same model of plane, so you're able to fit the same number of people in the plane. If you have the ability to price discriminate, as opposed to charging a flat fee for everybody, you're going to get two very different outcomes. So let's say we've got a market that looks like a purely monopolistic market. So here we go. Here's our graph. Here's quantity and price, and here's our demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. And we're just going to look at a flat marginal cost curve to make things simple for our analysis. We find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and let's say that means there's 100 people who buy tickets at the monopoly price. The monopoly price might be $300. But the plane holds 200 people. Well, in this case, you're only selling 100 tickets. So in this case, if our marginal cost is 100, we can determine what profit looks like for this firm. So price is 300, that's the profit maximizing price, and the quantity equals 100. So total revenue is equal to 300 times 100. But we also have to account for the marginal cost. Marginal cost is 100 times 100. So really what ends up happening is that our profit equals 200 times 100, or $20,000. That's the profit that we achieve. In fact, this is the maximum profit that this firm can achieve. We set the price equal to we set the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. We find what the price is by going up to the demand curve and across, and we find our price is 300. Total, so that's our price. We subtract our marginal cost. We get basically what's left over. What are we marking up over cost? Multiply that by the quantity, which is 100. But this airline has half-empty planes. There's lots of money left on the table. If we could sell 100 more tickets, we can make more money, even if the price we sold them for was less than the $300 maximum price. Let's assume that our second airline, instead of acting like a monopolist, charges a couple of different prices for their consumers. If, for example, they charge two different prices, one for their elastic customers of 200 and one for their inelastic customers of 400. Well, if they do that, they're actually going to be able to generate more profit. Here's demand, and here is our marginal cost. Remember, marginal cost was 100 in the last slide. So let's take a look at how this plays itself out. For the $400 customer up here, the quantity produced is only 50. But you sell at a higher price, so you sell 50 tickets, which generates more revenue for those particular 50 tickets. Now there's also the lower price of 200, and you're going to sell more than you would at the monopoly price. You're actually going to sell 150 of these tickets at 200. So at the $400 price, you sell 50 tickets. So that's 50 tickets times 400 minus the cost. So this is our price, this is our marginal cost, which equals 15,000. Now this is good for the business. It actually increases revenue over what you would have sold those tickets for if you'd have sold at 200. So for the monopolist, the monopoly price was 300 right here. So you're gaining some value by selling those 50 tickets at the higher price. That becomes profit for the firm. Now, those tickets that you sell at $200, there's some loss there. Remember, the monopoly sold at a price of 300, and they sold 100 tickets. If you're selling some of your tickets at $200, you're going to lose some of that higher price. So at $200, you sell 150 tickets, but we subtract the marginal cost, so that equals 15,000 as well. But you lose a little bit of money by reducing the price by $100 to 50 of the customers. So you're losing a little bit of money there, but you're selling to an additional 50 people. So you lose $100 per ticket to some customers, and you gain by selling more tickets. So what you end up doing is that you gain here and you gain here. You gain $5,000 by selling at a higher price, and you gain $5,000 here by selling more, even though you're selling at a lower price. So the total gain to your airline is $10,000. $10,000. The total revenue is $30,000 compared to the $20,000 when you sold at the monopoly price. Now, of course, if you're an airline and you could sell at more than 2 different prices, you're going to do that so you can increase profits even more. What a firm is really trying to do when it charges different prices is it's trying to price discriminate. And by doing that, you transfer consumer surplus to the producer. You're trying to transfer consumer surplus to the producer. And in the process, while the firm is doing better, they're actually serving more customers. In other words, in the process of price discrimination, there is the clear and distinct possibility of increasing welfare for the economy. Remember, when we look at a market, or when we look at the market graph, consumer surplus is the area above price and below the demand curve. And producer surplus is the area here below the price and above the supply curve. We want to maximize that, and we can maximize that by setting price equal to what the price would be at equilibrium. That equilibrium price is really the competitive price. So the closer we get to the competitive price, the larger the total surplus for the economy. So let's take a look at how this manifests itself, or how this plays out in the context of first degree or perfect price discrimination. So here's a market where we have a monopolist. There's a demand curve, here's our marginal revenue curve, and here is our marginal cost curve. The monopolist wants to set price equal to where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. They'll set that output. We'll call that QMON for monopoly. They go up to the demand curve to find the price of the monopolist. At that high price, what we find is that the monopolist is actually leaving this amount, A, which is this triangle up here, and this amount, B, which is this triangle over here. This is, of course, our deadweight loss, and this is our consumer surplus. They're leaving that value out there for other people to take, or in the case of the deadweight loss, for nobody to take. And there are a lot of customers who aren't served in this process. In competition, if we had a perfectly competitive market, where we would find ourselves is right out here. This is the competitive outcome, or the output, and this is the competitive price. In competition, we have a lot more people being served, but the monopolist isn't interested in that because it's not profit maximizing if they can only sell the product at one price. Setting two different prices, some at a high price and some at a low price, would increase the quantity that's sold and make the market more efficient and earn the firms more profits. This quantity monopoly, that's the profit maximizing price if there's only one price. But if the monopolist could charge different prices to different groups, they could start to capture some of the consumer surplus, and they could start to capture some of the loss that occurs in the situation where we have deadweight loss. Whenever we're dealing with price discrimination, in different market structures, we see that there are different results. So let's set up a table here. Here's perfect competition. Here's our monopoly. And here is the situation where we have perfect price discrimination. In terms of consumer surplus, in perfect competition, we can see that those areas, or that part of the model that's demonstrated by in terms of consumer surplus. So here again is marginal cost, demand, and marginal revenue. Here's the monopoly price, and here's the monopoly quantity. This area here, this area C, and this area A, and then the rest of this is B. Let's just do this in a different color. So if we were to use those areas, A, B, and C, we can determine what the consumer surplus is in perfect competition monopoly and with perfect price discrimination. In competition, the consumer surplus is area A plus B plus C. The firm sells at a price equal to marginal cost, and all of the area above marginal cost and below the demand curve, or above the price and below the demand curve, which is area A, B, C, that becomes consumer surplus. In the case of monopoly, consumer surplus is just area A. It's the area above the monopoly price and below the demand curve. And in perfect price discrimination, actually what we find is that there's no consumer surplus at all. Producer surplus, on the other hand, looks almost exactly the opposite. In the case of perfect competition, there's no producer surplus because the price is equal to marginal cost. In monopoly, the producer surplus is just area B. And in the case of perfect price discrimination, it's the monopolist that gets all of the surplus. The producer surplus is actually areas A, B, and C, and I'll show you that here in just a second. With deadweight loss, there's no deadweight loss in perfect competition because we sell this amount here, this quantity, which is the efficient quantity. So there's no deadweight loss with competition. In monopoly, the deadweight loss is area C in our graph. And actually with perfect price discrimination, there's no deadweight loss there either. And again, I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. So the total welfare in perfect competition is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, and that's A plus B plus C. For the monopoly, it's just A plus B, and for perfect price discrimination, it's the same as perfect competition. It's just that the welfare goes to the different side of the market. Instead of being the consumer surplus, now it's all producer surplus. So, in perfect competition and price discrimination, the entire area above the marginal cost and below the demand curve is converted into value. For perfect competition, it clearly favors the consumers. There's maximum efficiency. There's no deadweight loss, but the buyer benefits by capturing all of the surplus. In monopoly, there's a potential transfer, or actually I would say a clear transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus, but there's a deadweight loss. We have that area C, this part right here, that is lost to the market. Price discrimination favors the producer, but again, we have no deadweight loss because we're selling actually an amount that is equivalent to what happens in perfect competition. So there's no deadweight loss there either. So from an economic perspective, it really doesn't matter where things are distributed. It doesn't matter whether the consumer gets them or the producer gets them. What we're looking for is an increase in efficiency. So economists actually look at at perfect competition and price discrimination as almost exactly the same in terms of efficiency. And that's a big deal. So where does that perfect price discrimination, what does that look like? Well, basically, it looks like this. It looks like the situation where if we have a price that's set right here, and we'll say that that price is equal to marginal cost, there's someone who would pay a price up at this point, and there's someone who would pay a price here, and there's someone who would pay this price. And what price discrimination means, at least first-degree price discrimination, is that all of these people will actually pay these prices. So if someone is willing to pay a price up here, a price that's very high, they actually have to pay that price. And for the person who wants to and is only able to pay a price that's low, well, guess what? That's the price that you pay. And if someone can only pay a price equal to marginal cost, well, guess what? That's what you pay. And so everybody pays the price that they're willing and able to pay, so that this whole area becomes producer surplus. It's all transferred from the consumer who, when everybody pays the single price, let's say this is our single price, well, the person who's willing to pay the high price gets consumer surplus. And now we're forcing that person to pay what their true willingness and ability to pay is. So let's take a look at an example problem of how consumer surplus and producer surplus change, and specifically what happens when we price discriminate. So what we're going to look at here are 7 possible customers who are interested in a 30-minute helicopter ride. The helicopter has room for 7 passengers, and the marginal cost of adding a passenger is equal to 10. So here, first of all, are our customers. We have Amelia, and we have Orville, and we have Wilbur, we have Neil, Chuck, Buzz, and Carol. So these are our potential customers, and each of one of these have a maximum willingness to pay. So here's their maximum willingness to pay. Amelia said if necessary she'll pay $80. Orville says he'll pay $70. Wilbur would only pay $40. Neil says he'll pay $50. Chuck is willing to pay $60. Buzz would pay $100, and Carol says, no, I'll only pay $20. And each one of these people is a particular age. So Amelia is 66, and Orville's 34, Wilbur's 17, Neil's 16, Chuck is 9, Buzz is 49, and Carol is also 9 years old. So there we have our potential customer base, or marginal cost, or maximum willingness to pay, and their age. If you only charge one single price, what price would you charge? Well, to answer that question, we need to kind of set this table up a little bit differently. So we have some clearer information, at least more organization to the table. So let's take a look at our customers. We'll take a look at the maximum that they're willing to pay. We'll take a look at what happens if we charge them a particular price, and then we want to look at total revenue and marginal revenue. Because remember, profit maximization occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We know the marginal cost equals 10, so maybe it would behoove us to know what the marginal revenue is in order to find the profit maximizing output. So if we were to order these customers based upon their willingness to pay, we would have Buzz, Amelia, Orville, Chuck, Neil, Wilbur, and Carol. That's our order. The maximum willingness to pay for Buzz was $100. And so if the price is $100, then our total revenue would be $100 because we would sell one ticket to Buzz at a price of $100. So we would go from a total revenue of 0 when we had no customers to a total revenue of 100, which would make our marginal revenue 100. Well, as we know, if marginal revenue is above cost, then we should increase our output. So let's see what happens if we have Amelia come along and at a price of 80, that's her maximum willingness to pay. So let's charge her that. But now we're not only charging Amelia 80, but we're also charging Buzz 80. So that's 2 customers at a price of 80. So 2 times 80 gives us a total revenue of 60, which means our marginal revenue is 60. We go from 100 up to 160. Our marginal revenue is 60. which is still above our marginal cost of 10. So maybe what we want to do is look at charging a third customer. Orville's willingness to pay is 70. And so if we charged a price of 70, that would be 3 customers at a price of 70, so our total revenue would be 210. Making our marginal revenue 50, going from 160 to 210. Our next customer is Chuck. Chuck had a maximum willingness to pay of 60. Neil had a maximum willingness to pay of 50. Wilbur had a maximum willingness to pay of 40, and Carol had a maximum willingness to pay of 20. So if we look at the price charged is equal to the maximum of our added customer, and our total revenue is the number of customers times that particular price. So if we add the 4th customer, who is Chuck, 4 times 260 is 240. With Neil, the price is 50. If we had 5 customers, then our total revenue would be 250. With Wilbur, we would have 6 customers at a price of 40, which means our total revenue is 240. And with Carol, in order to get her as a customer, we need to charge everybody 20, which is 7 customers at $20, which is a total revenue of 140. Now you look at the total revenue column, and if that's all you look at, you might say, well, we just want to stop with Neil. The total revenue is to maximize, but we're interested in maximizing profit. And in order to do that, we need to find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We've already started that process. We know that the marginal revenue for Buzz is 100. The marginal revenue by adding Amelia is 60. The marginal revenue for adding Orville is 50. If we add Chuck, then the difference between total revenues is 30. If we add Neil, oh my, marginal revenue is 10. If we added Wilbur, then we actually lose revenue. It's minus 10. And if we added Carol, we'd have a minus 100. And our marginal revenue is 10, and our marginal cost is 10. So if we are interested in maximizing profit, we want to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 customers. That's what our quantity would equal. And our profit would equal price. So here's profit. Price times quantity, because that's revenue, minus marginal cost times quantity. So price times quantity is 5 times a price of 50. So 5 times 50 gives us $250 in terms of revenue, minus marginal cost of 10 times quantity. So 10 times 5 is 50, which gives us a profit of $200, and that's actually going to be our maximum profit, according to the profit maximizing rule. So a monopoly here is going to charge a price of 50, get 5 customers, and maximize their profit. But what if the company charges 2 different prices? What should those 2 different prices be, and how would you separate the customers? Well, we want to separate those customers. We want to arrange the customers by something that we can definitively separate them on, and that is their age. So if we separate the customers based on age, as opposed to willingness to pay, what we're going to find is, based on the information that we have, here's our customer, here's their willingness to pay, here's their age, and then we can start looking at price, total revenue, and marginal revenue. And we might actually be able to identify something about age that allows us to set prices based on that information. So here's our customers based on age. We had Buzz, Amelia, and Orville. And then we have Chuck, Neil, Wilbur, and Carol. what I've done here is I've set them up based on their ages. So the Buzz is 49, Amelia's 66, Orville's 34, Chuck is 9, Neil is 16, Wilbur's 17, and Carol is 9. Except for, of course, I put this in the wrong column. So let's change that. The willingness to pay for Buzz was 100, Amelia was 80, Orville was 70, Chuck was 60, Neil was 50, Wilbur was 40, Carol was 20. And again, what we want to do is have the price be equivalent to the willingness to pay. And everybody pays the price unless we segment this market. So what we might want to do is separate this market based on age. And let's take a look at what happens if we do that. Let's set up a clear distinction here between the old people and the young people. We're going to set that distinction right here. We're basically going to say 18 and over, or maybe even 21 and over, you pay a certain price, and 18 and under, you pay a different price. So if that's the case, what we might want to do is set the old people price at 70. That would be Orville. So we get all three of these older folks. So the total revenue would be, if it's just Buzz, it would be 100. If it's Amelia and Buzz, it would be 160, because 2 times 80 gives us 160. Both customers pay this price. If we have Orville, then all 3 customers pay 70, and so 3 customers times 70 is 210. If the old people price is $70, then total revenue for the old people is 210. If we look at the young people and we want to set a particular price, now what we want to do is we want to see where our marginal revenue gets the closest to the marginal cost. So if we charge everybody $60 in this young group, then our total revenue is 60. If we charge everybody $50, then we're going to have Neil and Chuck each pay 50, so that's 2 times 50, which gives us 100. If we add Wilbur, then that means we have 3 people paying $40. 3 times 40 is 120. And then if we charge the price that Carol is willing to pay, that would be 4 people at a price of 20, which means our total revenue is only 80. So now again, it's marginal revenue that's the important thing that will help us to determine how much people are paying. So, marginal revenue in the old person group is 100 for the first, and then 60, and then 50. Well, those prices are all above marginal cost, so we should be okay charging that price of 70. For the kids, however, we see that marginal revenue for Chuck is 60. Marginal revenue, the difference between total revenue for Neil is 40. The marginal revenue for Wilbur is only 20. And if we add Carol, then our marginal revenue is actually negative, and that's not good. So really what we're going to do is say to Carol, Carol, we're not going to serve you. Your price is too low. Forget it. Your willingness to pay is too low. But for the young people, what we want to do is to set a price equal to Wilbur's price, which would be 40, which would give us 3 people at $40 and a total revenue of 120. So for the adults, we have a price of 70, we have a quantity of 3, we have total revenue of 210, our marginal cost is only $10 per person with a quantity of 3, so if we take total revenue of 210 minus our costs, which are the marginal cost times the quantity, which is, again, $10 times 3. Then we take 210 minus 30, which gives us a profit of 180 for the old people. Now for the young people, let's just do this in a different color to make sure we can differentiate this. Our total revenue is 120. The cost is, again, marginal cost times Q. In this case, we're still serving 3, so it's 10 times 3. So it's 120 minus 30, so that gives us a profit of 90. And if we add those two numbers up, we have a total profit of 270. By price discriminating, what we're doing is we're actually increasing our profit. If you remember, when we just charged the monopoly price, our profit was $200. By charging two different prices, you can increase your profits by $70. And instead of selling 5 tickets, like we did with the monopoly, we add that 6th customer. So now, through price discrimination, the firm is made better off, and the customer is made better off because there are more people who are acquiring the good that makes them better off. Now, this is supposed to be illegal, so how do you get away with it? Well, you just simply say, well, kids weigh less, so their marginal cost is actually less. We're doing this on a cost basis. And that's all you need to say to defend your position. So, in first degree price discrimination, what ends up happening is that we charge everybody the price that they're willing and able to pay, so that price ends up equaling marginal revenue. And as a result of that, we set price where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And we find quantity based on that. But because everybody pays a different price, it isn't a single profit maximizing price. The firm captures all of the consumer surplus because everybody's paying a different price. If price is equal to, demand is equal to marginal revenue. So here is the price, or the quantity, that maximizes profit. And everybody pays a different price. And all of that value goes to the seller. In this case, you capture all the consumer surplus for the seller. That's first degree price discrimination, but there are other kinds of price discrimination. One of the other kinds of price discrimination is what we call second degree price discrimination. First degree price discrimination is actually incredibly difficult to accomplish. Second degree price discrimination is a more likely outcome of markets. What you're doing here is that you're separating customers into blocks. So everybody doesn't pay their exact willingness and ability to pay, but you separate people into different groups so that you can try to get more of that consumer surplus for the producer. One example of this would be the movie industry. If you go to the movies, when they first come out, you're going to pay a much higher price. So we're just going to label that as a 1. If you say wait until the movie comes out in kind of the cheaper theater, we'll call that price 2. You might want to get the pay-per-view version of the movie. That might be price $3. You might go to Redbox. You get it price $4. You might get the price at the kind of the cable price, and then maybe you'll see the movie on network television, although nobody really does that anymore. But each different type of price option for the moviegoer is additional money in the pockets of the movie producer. And so as the seller, you want to try to separate your product into as many blocks as you can to capture as much consumer surplus as you can. So if you charge a price here at P1, then you get all of this consumer surplus for yourself as the seller. If you charge the second price, whatever that is, you get this consumer surplus as the seller. And if you charge this price, this third price, you get this amount for the seller. And if you charge this price, you get this amount of producer surplus or consumer surplus. It's transferred to you. And then if you charge this price, you get this kind of next to last price. You get that amount of producer or consumer surplus transferred to you. And so there's a lot of that consumer surplus that's transferred to the seller. And part of the value, of course, is that we end up with this being the actual market quantity, which is good. We get to the point where we are producing an amount that's equivalent to the consumer surplus that would exist in a competitive market. But as opposed to first-degree price discrimination, where there is no deadweight loss, in second-degree price discrimination, there is some deadweight loss. This value here, there are these values that I'm coloring in black. These are values that don't go to anybody. Those are our deadweight losses. So there is a little bit of deadweight loss, but it's not as bad as if you were dealing with a monopoly. And actually, the monopolist would earn more money by charging these different prices. So what you need to do is you need to be able to identify your customers so you can separate them into these blocks. Self-selection helps, of course. You've got people who want to watch a movie the first time it comes out. They might be waiting in line or camped out in front of the movie theater like they do with Star Wars. So people can self-select into these groups, and that helps the producer to separate the consumers. Now you want to, of course, be able to keep your movie off of the internet, because if you can't do that, then it's going to be hard to keep these people separate. Now, there are some things that you want to consider as you're looking at price discrimination. You want to prevent resale. You need to keep people from jumping from one movie to the next without paying. But for the most part, people are pretty honest when it comes to movies, which allows the movie theaters and the movie production companies to price discriminate. Okay, the last type of price discrimination that I want to talk about is third-degree price discrimination. In third-degree price discrimination, you can divide the customers into roughly two groups, but really not much more than that. Third-degree price discrimination occurs by separating people into groups based on things like age, whether you're a student or not, so student discounts. Time preference is another way that we can separate people. So you go to a matinee movie, or you go to the early bird special, or you fly the red-eye flight. Essentially, this is all based on elasticity of demand. I mean, you can think about this in terms of tuition as well. In-state tuition, you go close. You think about the price that you're going to pay, but there are plenty of other places you could go. By choosing to go to a school in-state, you have chosen an option despite having lots and lots and lots of other choices. So typically what happens in state is that your price is lower because demand is more elastic. But if you're out of state and you go to, so let's say you're from, I'll say Nevada, and you go to Robert Morris, or you go to let's say a PA state school, you've got plenty of options out there, but you've chosen to go to Pennsylvania, which reflects to the people charging the price a degree of inelastic demand. So they can charge you more if you're from out of state, because you could go in state in Nevada, but you've just chosen not to. Now, in terms of what that looks like for third-degree price discrimination, we're going to have to use our imaginations a little bit. And take a look at what a graph might, or how a graph might appear if we were to take an elastic view of the world and an inelastic view of the world. If marginal cost is right here, and we were to say, try to find where marginal revenue equals marginal cost and set a price at that level, we might have something that looks like this. So P1, and I know it's kind of small in there, but you can sort of see it. That's the price that's charged for the elastic customer. For the inelastic customer, we might have something that looks more like this. So here's P2. Because marginal revenue equals marginal cost sets the quantity, and then we go up to the demand curve to find the price, we see that P2 is greater than P1. So this is our marginal revenue for the elastic, and this is our marginal revenue for the inelastic firm. And that P2 price is above the P1 price. The elastic market is paying a lower price. The inelastic market pays a higher price. Now, regardless of which type of price discrimination we're dealing with, price discrimination can actually be pretty good. In terms of first-degree price discrimination eliminates all deadweight loss. That's a huge advantage for a market. It basically moves the market to the competitive output where more people are served. One example of this might be the old-fashioned country doctor, where if you charge uniform prices, then many of your rural patients in particular, just aren't going to pay. And the rich get a pretty big bargain. So what you do is you charge the rich more. You charge the poor whatever they can pay. It might be chickens or a bushel of corn or whatever price that they can pay. But you end up serving a lot more people. With second-degree price discrimination, what we again see is that output goes up. So output clearly goes up in first-degree price discrimination, but it goes up in second-degree price discrimination, not all the way to where price equals marginal cost. In other words, not all the way to the competitive output, but it's better than if you have a monopoly. So it's not as high as if you have perfect competition, but it's much better than monopoly. And as a result of this, we see less deadweight loss than in a monopoly setting. But we do have to be a little bit careful. There's something to consider here. If you're bad at assigning someone to a group, remember second-degree price discrimination is breaking people down into blocks, then you could cause there to be less sold. So for example, if you think a low-price customer is a high-price customer, then they walk away. You have to be able to clearly identify how people can fit into your blocks. because otherwise you might lose profit and you might cause fewer people to be served. In terms of third-degree price discrimination, this is a little bit more complicated. There's still a lot of deadweight loss, and it can manifest itself in kind of odd ways. Deadweight loss exists, but it's not as bad as monopoly. But you do have to be careful because that deadweight loss can look weird. It can be something like waiting in a line. If you've ever been out shopping on Black Friday and people sit out and wait in lines, we had a restaurant recently opened near where I live, and they promised the first, I think, 100 customers into the new restaurant free sandwiches for life. And there was a line of people who wanted to get into that restaurant to get that value. But that is a deadweight loss. That's a type of deadweight loss because it's not productive. That being said, we know that welfare is improved with third-degree price discrimination because it allows there to be a market where one wouldn't have existed otherwise if uniform prices were enforced, even with third-degree price discrimination. What we see is that more people get served. And that's good. That is efficiency increasing. If you can sell your excess inventory to someone at a low price, then that's kind of cool. That's kind of good. And if there's a market then both the buyer and the seller are benefited by selling at different prices, even though it seems kind of odd. So why don't we ban price discrimination as the law suggests? Why do we allow it? I mean, the law says we shouldn't. Well, part of the reason is because by forcing uniform prices on people, we might actually get really high prices for everyone. Uniform prices might be higher than they should be, or than they could be, or than they would be if we had price discrimination. The ability to charge a low price leads to more competition. So, price discrimination sounds bad, but it might not be as bad as we think. So that's some background and some specifics on price discrimination. Price discrimination is a pretty interesting thing because it sounds like it should be something we shouldn't allow. But economists are less pessimistic about price discrimination. In fact, a lot of economists, most economists, especially free market economists, look at price discrimination as a way of drawing people into markets who wouldn't otherwise be there. So as you hear a lot about people maybe trying to take advantage of the coronavirus and become profiteers, maybe you want to think about that a little bit differently in the context of price discrimination. Because if you are able to charge people different prices based on their willingness and ability to pay, you might actually end up serving a lot more people than you would if you charged everyone a flat price.